I thought that I would talk a little bit today about how I figured out that I was of a trans experience. Um, I think that everybody has like a different story. So I knew from a very young age that something was wrong. If that makes sense. Not something was wrong, like that I was uncomfortable. Like I was constantly trying to make efforts to feel more comfortable. I sometimes wonder if my experience would have been different had I not been, or had I been exposed to trans characters on television and LGBTQ issues when I was younger, but I wasn't really. So I think that in hindsight, looking back, a lot of what was going on inside of me was kind of a classic trans experience in the sense that I felt very, very uncomfortable with my body, especially my body around puberty. Some of the changes, like very subtle changes. For example, like growing hips, like I hated that. It just made me so upset. I just felt like it wasn't me, you know? So it's sort of like, the only way I can describe it is like one's body changing in a way that isn't how you imagine your body to be. So it was very confusing because I think that we're sort of also told that, you know, puberty is angsty and difficult, and so I kind of attributed it to that. And also at the same time, I was very interested chemically and, you know, sexually interested in boys, you know? And I sometimes think, I mean, that's sort of the case today, that I like boys and girls, but I think in part of it is part of me, and I still have this, I'm like, do I want to be you? Or do I want to go on a date with you, you know? I don't know if it's like body envy or actual interest, and I think that, I mean, that's, again, a common experience of many people, but so basically, as a kid, even the idea of being gay never crossed my mind. I just knew that I was really uncomfortable and really unhappy with those changes. There was just an incredible amount of shame around it, so that was hard. And I think that, you know, the way I compensated for feeling so uncomfortable in my body, and I think ultimately uncomfortable in my sort of gender role or gender expectations, was that, like, I sort of went through like a lot of phases, like a lot of like gender performances. You know, I dressed the part. Like I was always dressing the part because it was like I didn't have my own innate sense of my own gender. You know, I didn't, or I wasn't putting together pieces that I was having a trans experience and trying to cope with that in a world that I feel like has pretty specific gender roles for the two sexes. So I think that things started to get a little bit easier for me when I came out as gay, in some senses. And it, you know, I just fell in love with a woman who was great. It wasn't because all of a sudden I was like, I'm gay, and like joined a gay community. Like I fell in love with a woman and, you know, started to become introduced to some gay culture. But I knew right from the start that I wasn't a lesbian. And I think that we just like innately know our communities, you know? So I just knew it wasn't my people. So in a sense that was kind of scary, because I'm like, shit, like am I just somebody who is just like obsessed with alienation or what? I mean, so I think that like I had my big aha moment when I moved to the little city that I'm living in now about 3 years ago. I went to see this show by this like hip-hop group, this trans guy hip-hop group. So it was two female to male trans folk in a group called Athens Boys Choir, and they sang a lot about their trans experience. And I specifically remember being at that show, and like first or second song I was like, that is me, like that's my experience up there. I mean, it was such an incredible moment. I was like, that moment of feeling like I had found my people for the first time. Can you imagine, like my whole life I never had that feeling of feeling like I was with my people. And I felt like I was always kind of looking, and I was like, that's my experience. But at the same time, I mean, it was so scary. Can you imagine, like, just all of a sudden being like, that's me, I'm a tranny, great, what do I do now? Because there's so many layers. For me, there's so many layers of sort of like, oh my God, like, how am I going to deal with this? Is this really my experience? Am I really brave enough to make all these changes? And I think the best thing about that group is they talk a lot about, like, gender role expectations. Like a lot of them are like, you know, F to M trans guys like myself, like, don't have to be this hyper masculine expression. You know, I am sort of somewhere in the middle. Like, I'm kind of like an effeminate guy, if that makes sense. And I think that, like, the fact that, like, I was constantly straddling all these things, like interested in men and women sexually, interested in sort of more classical effeminate things, but from a male perspective. I always use the analogy of, like, I would have been that little boy who wanted to do ballet or, like, wear a tutu and was kind of sad that, you know, I got made fun of or it wasn't socially acceptable. You know, like, I wanted to be a boy that cross-dressed or something. You know, I was like a gay boy, you know? So all those different things, like, they're really complicated and hard to work through, especially in a society that, you know, is homophobic and is extremely judgmental of feminine expressions in men, you know? So you've got all these things you're working with. But I do think that moment was huge for me. It was huge, where I realized, like I had found my people. And granted, that was 3 years ago, and I've been, like, on this journey where I've, like, fought and pushed and pulled with this whole thing, you know? But it was, like, an amazing moment. Like, I look back on it, and the funny thing is this summer I went to a camp for trans people in Michigan, and I ran into that performer, one of the performers from that group, and I told him, I was like, you know what, 3 years ago I saw you perform, and that's when I realized I was trans, and it was, like, this great moment. It was, like, I don't know, really heartwarming or something. We had this great conversation, and I think that's, like, definitely the role that I hope to fulfill someday as a trans person, is to, like, be there for other trans people, because our experience is hard. I mean, like, not everybody's is hard, but our experience of, like, trying to find, like, in a sense, we have this innate compass of who we are, right? But we're always, we're trying to, like, almost pull it up to find the words to tell ourselves, right? And a lot of the ways that we discover things is, like, in each other, right? So it's like, basically, I just never had a mirror to look at, you know? Like, when I went to this camp for trans people this summer, like, I completely freaked out. And I think in part, I had never been in a space with all trans people, right? Like, I had never had that experience of being around all people who are having my experience. It was crazy. It was really awesome, but also really scary, because I also knew that, like, I was not taking steps to be who I was, to transition and do all the things I needed to do, come out to my family. And I think, like, I went there being like, I knew I was trans, but I was sort of, like, stuck in this sort of, you know, coming up with all the excuses about why I shouldn't transition, why it's, like, so much harder for everybody else, and that there is a way I can find an in-between, blah, 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 some bullshit like that, you know? Because I was really scared, you know? So I feel like I have, like, a lot to say about, like, after I transition. Like, I'm really excited to, like, talk about, like, feminism in trans communities. Like, because ultimately, like, I was born and socialized a female. So therefore, I think that a second wave thought, like a lot of people saw trans masculinity as sort of like this rejection of, or betrayal to female identity. And I think ultimately, like, I can be the best ally, you know, like, I'm sort of like this hybrid, right? So, like, feminism should be, like, this huge priority to me, like, talking about women's issues from a trans experience perspective, because I'm sort of going to, like, have this life where I experience both perspectives, right? I mean, it's good to, like, have all this stuff clarifying, but it's complicated, but it's cool. It's such a journey. While I would never change my experience for anything, like, I spent a lot of years being like, what is it? Like, what feels really wrong right now? Like, what doesn't feel right? Like, you know, why can't I just be myself? And, like, couldn't be myself because I wasn't a physical expression of myself. And not to say that, like, even now, like, I'm not on testosterone. I feel much more myself because I've identified what's going on. I think T is, like, the last step in the process of, like, learning about one's trans identity, but I don't know. So that's sort of like my my background.